now have a panel led by Lori Goducki, who is, for those of you who are active in the criminal justice reform movement, you know her, or you know MacArthur Foundation, which is the single largest benefactor to criminal justice reform efforts in the country, is actually driving a lot of the changes that we're hoping to promote through this forum. So we're very fortunate to have her lead this initiative. I'll just say we had a chance to visit before, and she mentioned how she had received the Robert F. Kennedy Award, Action Award, Justice Action Award. And I have to say that, being someone as she is who's fighting for criminal justice reform, how perfect it is that she received an award named after Robert Kennedy, who, as Attorney General, was the one that started the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, which for many of us we know it's all about prevention, is the ultimate answer to the challenges that we're speaking about today in terms of our criminal justice system. And so now, thank you, Lori, for being here, and I know you'll welcome our guests.
Thank you, and thanks. And thank you to the Kennedy Forum for this auspicious occasion. It is quite a remarkable audience that we have here with diverse stakeholders, consumers, and other participants in the behavioral health and the criminal justice system. But our task today is to broaden that conversation and to look at it from a number of different angles to ensure that in addressing these issues, this problem, that we confront it from all angles and all perspectives. So I'm joined on the stage this morning by Mary Giliberti, who is the CEO of the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, by Cornell Brooks, an attorney previously associated with the NAACP and continues to advise both the public and private sector about civil rights issues, Mark Holden, who is the Senior Legal Counsel of Koch Industries, Patricio Marquez with the World Bank, and Sam Ciata, currently a carpenter here in Illinois. So I'm going to just say a few words about the dimensions of the problem that we're confronting today, to remind us that while we define this on some occasions as a public health issue, it's also a matter of racial and social justice. And that brings us to think about this in terms of human rights as well as civil rights. And while people who suffer from mental health and addiction disorders deserve the same treatment and access to quality of care, the supports and services they need to fully participate in our society. And the recovery is a long road, and that all of us have a stake in terms of not only public safety, public health, individual well-being, communities working together, but all of us have a stake in this, not any individual institution and system. So with that, Mary, I want to ask you a question about how does the lack of access to quality care and treatment lead to involvement with other systems that often fail people?
Absolutely. Well, good morning, everyone. And I want to put the lack of access to services and supports in a larger context of systemic and structural discrimination against people with mental illness and their families. Because I think when we think about Martin Luther King Day, we understand that there are structural and systemic racism in the United States. When we think about the Me Too movement, we understand that what's happening to women is part of structural and systemic discrimination. And when we look at people in the criminal justice system jailed because they are ill, we have to understand that in the context of systemic and structural discrimination that begins very early on. I saw tables of young people here, and I want to congratulate you all for coming because I have teenagers, and there's no way they would sit through an entire day of this information. But early intervention is the first place that we're failing. We understand that the research tells us that if we intervene early, particularly in the most serious illnesses, people will get better jobs, they'll get education, they won't wind up in ERs and jails, and yet we don't do it. We don't have public awareness of programs and what we should be looking for, and we don't have the programs. We have early psychosis programs that are just beginning. No one knows about them. They're not well financed, and they're certainly not nationwide. So when you look at the scope of the problem, suicide, the second leading cause of death in 15 to 24-year-olds, and you look at the response, that can only be explained as discrimination. And then we look at access to services. When people go to get care, out of network, out of pocket. So you're out of luck. And I take helpline calls. One of my favorite things to do as the CEO of NAMI is to go down to our helpline and take calls. And almost every time I take calls, I get one from someone who is involved in the criminal justice system. Now, I promise you, the CEO of the American Heart Association, if she goes to take helpline calls, or the CEO of the American Diabetes Association, is not taking calls about the criminal justice system. But I am. And the reason I am is during those calls, they will say to me, I tried to get care. I made all these phone calls. I knew they needed help, and I couldn't get that help. I've even talked to a mom and a dad who continue to argue today about whether they should have called the police when their son was in crisis. That's the debate that parents have to have. No one should have to have that debate, because that gets to the access to care when someone is in crisis. As Sheriff Dart said this morning, when you're in crisis, he said, if you're having a heart attack, they don't rush you to jail. When you're having a heart attack, you expect that the emergency technician who comes to you, or when you get to the ER room, they know how to handle what's going on with you. Not so with a mental health crisis. And we know these are conditions where people have crises, and yet we have a system that does not provide enough mobile crisis, that when you get to the hospital does not have protocols, and when you're released does not have aftercare to the level that you should get, so you don't wind up bouncing from hospital to emergency room and back again, which we see so frequently. So again, when you think about these things that are happening to people, these systemic things, that's what's going on. It is discrimination. We are one of the only conditions where there are still in Medicare limits on hospital days. We're one of the only conditions where if you're in certain facilities, Medicaid won't cover you. We're one of the only conditions when a psychiatrist bills for the service, as opposed to a primary care doctor, the psychiatrist gets paid less than a primary care doctor. The only way to describe this is systemic discrimination, and that's what's driving people to be in a system where they should never be. And it is so wrong, unjust, and inhumane.
So Mary is quite passionate about the moral and ethical considerations and how they play out in discriminatory practices towards people who suffer from mental health and addiction disorders. But Cornell, as we know, this isn't just a matter of criminal justice reform. This is a broader set of social justice issues. And there's also a matter of the rule of law. In what ways do you think, looking at this from a civil rights perspective and from tools that we have with the Americans with Disabilities Act, how has that given us another leverage point with respect to systems change?
Sure, certainly. Let me just start with the theme of the conference. So when we talk about bending toward justice, we are in fact invoking the words of Martin Luther King, whose memory we honored yesterday in terms of when he said the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. He was invoking the words of Theodore Parker. So in other words, we are invoking the civil rights movement, and before that, the abolitionist movement. And so there's a language, there's a set of strategies that we have to employ. Those strategies relate, of course, to litigation. Those strategies relate to our media campaigns. Those strategies relate to our moral campaigns. But what they suggest is a couple of things. Number one, that we cannot afford to be siloed. Our litigators, our advocates, our health care professionals, those who specialize in criminal justice reform have to understand that we are part of a large and powerful justice movement. So that means Descriptively, we have to speak in terms of opportunity. We are in the midst of a Twitter-age civil rights movement, and our moment is now. Number two, we have to speak in terms of our capacity to affect change. And so that means we cannot merely describe the problem precisely. We have to describe our capacity to affect change in morally ambitious terms. That speaks to our litigation strategies. It speaks to how we use the law. But it's not just a matter of litigating in the courts, not just a matter of using the ADA, it's not a matter of using our civil rights statutes creatively. It's about embodying and putting the litigation in context. Because when we think about the civil rights movement, it was not merely Thurgood Marshall, but it was also Martin Luther King. It was not merely Medgar Evers, it was Recy Taylor and Rosa Parks. And so we need a broad strategy where we have all of our professionals working together. Lastly, I want to emphasize this. We have to convey a certain certainty of moral ambition. When we talk about bending toward justice, we're not ambivalent about our ends. We are not hesitant. We are confident. In the same way that the minister invoked the Lord in an inclusive way, we are also suggesting that we're going to bring about justice for the people that we serve and whose aspirations and ambitions have been entrusted to us. And so I simply want to say that now is our time. It is our time. And for us to speak in any terms other than a certain moral certainty is to miss the moment.
Thank you, Cornel. So, Mark, you have come from this set of issues from a somewhat different vantage point, not being either in the behavioral health field or a civil rights lawyer. You come from the private sector. How do you view this issue today in this current environment and how we should approach the problem and coming to solutions?
Well, I mean, the criminal justice system is the epitome of a failed big government program, failed top-down approach, one size fits all, doesn't work, won't work. Bryan Stevenson, who I'm sure everybody in this room knows or has read his book, Just Mercy, calls it a two-tiered system where the rich and guilty are treated better than the poor and innocent. And he's absolutely right. And so we've got a system, and for a long time it's been messed up, but it got super messed up in the war on drugs in the 1980s. I was a prison guard in Worcester, Massachusetts. I just graduated high school. It was 1981. And that job was the greatest job I had until I went to law school, and it opened my eyes up big time. There were a number of people I went to junior high and high school with who I'd lost track of who were incarcerated. And these were a bunch of poor white kids, mostly. My point of view is it ensnares the poor the most, with a disproportionate impact, obviously, on people of color. But our system really just targets the poor. And if you've got enough money, you can kind of stay out of it. And if you don't, you're going to get run over. And so when I hear that some people in Washington want to relitigate and refight the war on drugs, it just makes my head want to explode. Because, newsflash, drugs won. Drugs are going to keep winning. It's just how it is. The rate of illegal drug usage is higher now than it was during the start of the war on drugs. And what do we have to show for it? Well, you have a criminal justice system, really, in my opinion, for two reasons. To protect public safety. So keep people away from society who are a threat to public safety. But then you have an obligation, if you run a prison, to make that person better. So they come out less violent, they come out with skills, they come out with hope. So second chances, that's a huge thing. Our criminal justice system, by and large, does none of that. Now, there are exceptions. I'm going to talk about that in a bit. But by and large, it targets the poor, targets the least among us, swept up people with drug addictions, people with mental illness. And we've filled up our prisons and jails, 2 million or so people. What do we have to show for it? Well, in this country today, there are 1 in 3 people with a criminal record. That's as many people with a criminal record that have a college degree. We've got 1 in 28 children in this country who have a parent or parents in prison. And they're going to have their own issues in the criminal justice system as well. So we've made it generational. We've got a system. Now, I'm sure it wasn't intentional, but from 1990 to 2005, on average, every 10 days in this country, we built a new federal or state facility, jail, prison. We also spend 3 to 4 times more per capita in this country on incarceration than we do on education. So we've got everything exactly backwards. We really do. We really do. But there is hope. And what I think where the hope's coming from is from the states. The states have had to tackle this issue because they're responsible for their own budgets. And so this may be news to some of you, probably not people who are in this room who are advocates for criminal justice reform, but it all started in 2007 with Texas. Texas has now reduced their crime rates since 2007 to historic lows, 1960s lows. They've closed 8 prisons, they've saved billions of dollars. That's the model. That happens, it's happened across the country in 32 different states now. That's shown you can reduce incarceration rates and we can reduce also crime rates. And then you can keep families together and communities together. And it makes us all better and saves us a ton of money that we could then use on things like mental health, schools, roads, you name it. So for me, that is the path forward. It shouldn't be so difficult at the federal level, but it is for whatever reason. It was difficult for the last 8 years, even under a president like President Obama, who worked really hard on it. We couldn't get what we wanted to get. Now, with President Trump in office, believe it or not, we had a meeting, I had a meeting with him and a number of other advocates on prison reform last week. And it's an issue that I think we could get some traction on. It's worked in the states, it saved money. And I think that basically we're going to have an opportunity to do that at the federal level as well. But at the end of the day, I mean, there are a lot of issues in our country, but I think Rand Paul probably put it best a couple of years ago. He said that if we don't fix our criminal justice system, we're in for big trouble. This tears at the fabric of society when people don't feel that the criminal justice system is just. So from my perspective, as the general counsel of a major company, for many years, we've hired people with criminal records. We've found them to be among our best workers. They're hungry, they're humble. We've hired people from Ivy League schools. I didn't go to an Ivy League school, thankfully, but I'm kidding. But we've hired people from Ivy League schools who aren't as good employees, who are whiny and entitled. So I'd encourage everyone who's an employer here to hire people with criminal records. The good news is, if you saw the New York Times article on the front page, I think it was, on Sunday, because of the labor crunch people are in, they're starting to hire more and more people with criminal records. And I think that's the path forward: jobs, education, mental health services, things like that. And I'd like to just end by saying that with prison reform, what we've seen in the States, again, people come out of prison better. They're skilled, they're ready to work, they're ready to get back in the game. It's a story of redemption that we should all get behind. So we're going to keep pushing for it, and hopefully you all will too.
Thank you, Mark. And I want to pick up on the theme that you addressed with respect to hope, and also what Mary has said about how we know there are effective interventions, supports, and services that allow people to remain in the community while they're addressing their behavioral health issues. And Sam, I'd like you to tell us a little bit about your story. I know you grew up here in Illinois, and that shortly after high school, you enlisted in the Marines, and you served time in Iraq, for which you were recognized as being an outstanding service person that contributed to the safety of our country and served with great deal of honor. And then came back to Illinois and had been receiving supports from the Veterans Administration and decided to go back to school. And it was in dealing with school and other issues that there was an incident that led you to become involved in the criminal justice system. And while you were incarcerated, the behavioral health problems and issues that had been receiving attention had been neglected. But through the good graces of the law and understanding your circumstances and situations, you came back out into the community. And have been very much on the road to recovery and are now awaiting full employment as a member of the Carpenters Union. Could you tell us about what your experience, both inside and outside the system, and dealing with your behavioral health issues. What have you learned that's important for this audience to know about hope?
Well, thank you for having me. Prior to me being incarcerated, I was actively seeking treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder, and was making a lot of good progress. When I got incarcerated, though, I didn't really know what to expect. I mean, a big concern of mine was, if I get incarcerated, am I going to get treatment, or am I going to backpedal, back to where I was, And it's kind of what happened, I can't speak for any other states, but at least in Illinois, there just really wasn't much anything surrounding mental health care. They kind of, bring in and they kind of ask you some questions, and you say, well, I'm diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, etc. And they kind of nod their heads, and jot it down. Other than that, every month I would see somebody, they would ask me, do you want to hurt somebody or do you want to hurt yourself? And you'd say no, and then you would just go back to your cell. So I kind of lost a lot of ground that I had made with the approximate 2 years that I had gotten treatment. I did 6 weeks inpatient treatment with the VA, and then I continued once a week for a year and a half after that. The criminal justice system, I mean, as far as mental health goes, I don't know. I kind of just feel like you're lost there, especially someone like me, anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, probably not the most productive place for somebody like that. I feel like there's a lot of other places you can put those people, at least if you're gonna have them there, at least, give them some treatment,
What, thank you, Sam. What have been the kinds of supports that you've had now that you're in the community that have made a difference in terms of you becoming, congratulations on your recent wedding, by the way, and what will help you stay in the community and continue to be working on your recovery?
I feel like busy hands kind of keep you out of a lot of trouble, kind of keep you focused, keeping busy, working. I continue my treatment. Once I started back up with that, I completely rebounded. I kind of regained, a lot that I had lost, as I know I would. If you stick to it, you get back to treatment, recognize, that you need it, because it's not always so obvious sometimes. Mm-hmm. But when I got out of being incarcerated, I kind of hit the ground running. I applied to some unions, the Carpenter Union. I got accepted. I continued my treatment. I went into my training to be an apprentice for the Carpenters Union. I did all that. Got married. I got a great support system, family, friends, my wife, treatment. All those things kind of come together as a package. If you're missing one of those, it's going to hurt you. So I feel like, having all those things, and you got to be aggressive with it. I got a mental disorder, so I can't get lazy with it. You got to. You got to go. You got to do it. You got to, reach out to your loved ones and your family and friends if you're down. And if you do those things, I think that's a good recipe for success.
So employment, training, education, housing, access to care, continuity in that care and treatment mean a lot for you and your success. I appreciate you sharing your story with you.
Thank you.
Patricia, we've been focusing on the United States and how we are addressing these issues. I know with your background from the World Bank, you look at these from a global perspective. And you also look at this not only as a public health issue or an issue of racial and social justice, but you look at more broadly in terms of what other countries are doing and how there's a shared approach or vision to what we could achieve in terms of justice for all. Could you speak to why the World Bank, which we think of as a financial institution, is concerned about this both from a global perspective, but also around the social determinants of public health issues?
Yes. Many thanks, Lori. First of all, colleagues, all, it's an honor to be here with all of you. Allow me to use this opportunity to salute the Kennedy Forum for have the courage to shine a light on an often forgotten and marginalized issue. And I would like to say that we are following what the Kennedy Forum has done here in the United States and trying to replicate in order to advance the mental health agenda globally, not only as a public health issue, but as a major issue for development. So in order to answer your question, Lori, allow me please to highlight 6 factors that will help address that question. First of all, just to put everything in perspective, the global burden of ill mental health and substance use disorders has been growing over the last 2 decades. 10% of the global population is afflicted with one type of other mental health disorder. That number increases to 25% among children and adolescents. Mental health disorders already are contributing to 30% of the global burden of disease, and that includes both mortality and morbidity. But it's not only that matters from a public health perspective, but also there is the issue of comorbidity. This morning we heard the mayor of Chicago talking about the need to avoid the dichotomy between mental health, substance use disorders, and I will say perhaps there is a need also, as Patrick Kennedy has been advocating, to avoid the false dichotomy between mental health and physical health. The brain is as important as the heart. The second point that I would like to highlight, as Lori has indicated, for us it should be clear that mental health is not only a biological byproduct, but is the byproduct of the mix of social determinants, environmental factors, biology, psychology, as well as neurodegenerative conditions. So it's a broad spectrum along a continuum of symptoms and disorders. And social determinants play a critical role, both not only in terms of demography, age, and ethnicity, in terms of socioeconomic conditions, particularly poverty, lack of opportunity, neighborhood conditions, overcrowding, environmental conditions, including crime, violence. All of these contribute to it, and certainly at the global level, violence, conflict are contributing to generate a major issue that needs to be tackled. But a third message, Lori, that I would like to mention is that it's not only a mental health issue, but also it has a tremendous economic cost that usually is forgotten. Recent studies have shown that the total economic cost of mental health in 2010 was about $2.4 trillion US dollars. And mental health costs between 2 and 4% of GDP, both in terms of direct and indirect costs. So what do we do with this? Given the low allocation of resources that lead to lack of access to basic mental health services as part of universal schemes to provide services, we need to adopt or identify multi-sectoral entry points, public health, jobs, education, the justice system reform that David was talking about in order to push forward this agenda. And at the end of the day, to conclude, colleagues, this is a major developmental issue. As we move into knowledge economies, and all the countries are moving into that, healthy brains become a premium. So we have to see that the investments in mental health is not an expenditure, but it's a major investment in order to accumulate health capital that contributes to human capital accumulation, the skills, the knowledge that generate value nowadays. And according to recent studies of the World Bank, those intangibles, the brains, the software, all those knowledge products account for 65% of the total wealth of the countries. So whatever we do on mental health, we have to see as a major investment to contribute to economic growth, to productivity increases, and more importantly, to improve social welfare for all. Thanks.
Thank you, Patricia. So in the time remaining, I'd like to give each of you a chance to comment on what your colleagues have said. We've looked at this now from the broader perspective of the law as a civil rights issue and a matter of eliminating discriminatory practices. We've looked at this in terms of the experiences of a person with behavioral health issues and the challenges they faced. We've talked about what the role of government should be in this regard, as well as the economic and fiscal considerations that factor in to an appropriate response. We know that there are 20 million admissions to jails annually, that 17% of those people suffer from a diagnosable psychiatric disorder at the time of their admission. We know there are best practices, evidence-based practices that would allow people to receive that treatment and care appropriately in the community and enable them to fully participate in society. With this audience, both at the state as well as at the local level, the solutions lie with all of us. What would you say to this audience about a step that they could take that would keep us on that long arc that we hope will be bending towards justice and doesn't become warped over the next generation? So Mary, I want to come back to you, and if each of you, we've got about 5 minutes left, if you could please be conscious of having all of your colleagues have a chance to speak.
Well, I think that my perspective comes from the membership that we have, the individuals and the families who are affected by these conditions. And some of the most powerful change that I've seen is when they become empowered, because this experience, whether it's trying to get care and not being able to do it, or being in the criminal justice system yourself, can be very disempowering. And when someone changes from seeing themselves as a patient or a criminal to an activist, it has tremendous power. And so one of the things that we've been working on that we would love to join with others to work on is how you empower people to be agents of change. Whether that's in telling their story to police officers so they do crisis intervention training to change those attitudes, change those outcomes for people, or whether it's going and talking to local officials, state officials, or national. We brought 1,000 people to Capitol Hill last summer Frankly, we'd like to be bringing millions of people to Capitol Hill to raise their voices, to be part of conversations so that politicians can see the need to respond to this, because the people affected have a very powerful voice, but often what has happened to them takes away that voice. And so working together, I think we can give them back their voice and make a difference.
So one of the things that I'm cognizant of is if we are on a calendar of justice, if you will, with today being the day after the commemoration of Dr. Martin Luther King's birthday, if we think about the fact that Dr. King was an excellent theoretician of nonviolence, but there were others who were even better than he was, like Bayard Rustin. But he was superb at popularizing, translating, transliterating, if you will, what worked to those who would like to work. And so if we took the expertise in this room, the analytic capacity in this room, the best strategies in this room, and get it out of this room and into the hands and into the minds and the hearts of those who can affect change, we make change. And so it's really a matter of us literally taking what we do well and what we do best and handing it over to those who would like to do it. And that means, quite frankly, translating what we do sometimes into popular terms, popular culture, using social media, engaging young people, engaging people who are not used to thinking of themselves as advocates and practitioners. But when you do that, movements are born, and you succeed.
Mark?
For me, it'd be, I ended on the note I ended on last time I spoke here just now was on hiring people who have criminal records. That's a huge opportunity for anyone who needs employees. We know that there are about 6 million skilled labor jobs that go wanting every year because there aren't enough people to fill them, but there are people coming out of prison who do get skilled up or had skills, but we have collateral consequences in place that keep people from being able to get jobs, real jobs, get housing, get benefits, that type of thing. So if you're an employer, hire someone who has a criminal record. Take a chance on them. It's this thing, we can talk about the legislation, that's important for sure, but this will be one person at a time, talking to one person, changing one person's life, who then changes another person's life. I would say for me, some of the most transformative activities that I've been engaged in the last couple of years is going to visit people in prisons with different groups I work with. One of them is Defy Ventures. Went out to Pelican Bay Supermax last summer, and I came back just as one of the most transformative spiritual experiences I've ever had, seeing these people who have been in prison a long time have hope and opportunity and a path forward. So I'd encourage people, and I'm sure a lot of you already do this, but visit people in prisons. They're forgotten. You talk about forgotten people. Reach out to them, reach out to people to try to help them get jobs, all that type of thing. A person at a time, make your community better. That's very important.
Sam?
I'll keep it short. As far as improving upon the criminal justice system, if they're gonna, continue on taking mentally ill people, at least change it up so that they leave, prison better than what they came in there. Providing programs and treatment.
Patricia?
Well, since I brought a global perspective, I will say that our message that we are trying to convey to different governments, particularly the ministers of finance, is to convey a clear message that development, both economic and social development, cannot occur without mental wellness. And I do believe, rephrasing what I said before, that as we are moving more and more into a globalized world, either we like it or we don't like it, that's a reality. And the competitiveness of nations, the productivity of nations will depend on major investments on human capital, as the Nobel Prize winner of economics from the University of Chicago, Gary Becker, used to say. Unless you have healthy, well-educated, mentally well people, you cannot compete, especially in an economy that more and more will require healthy brains. So it's mental health, mental wellness, healthy brains should be seen as an imperative for promoting economic growth, competitiveness, increased productivity, and more importantly, to have better societies, healthy societies for all.
Thank you. So this has been a remarkable start for a series of panel discussions and plenaries where we'll be able to probe more deeply into the issues and the challenges that our panelists have addressed. I want to thank them for sharing with us their stories, giving us their perspective. We certainly have the knowledge, the information from a number of perspectives about why this is a call to action. And we need to have the social strategies to exercise the political will to act on what we know, because we certainly know what failure looks like. So please, colleagues, join me in thanking our distinguished panel.